Hello everyone and welcome to the Advanced C# section. Today we're going to be taking a look at nullable types. So back in the fundamentals track, we started talking about the differences between value types and reference types. Now we mentioned that value types are structures, whereas reference types are classes. So as a quick review, let's take a look at two statements. Let's say we have int x equals 5 and random r equals new random. So in this code, int x equals 5, that is a value type, and random r equals new random, that is a reference type. So what's happening is int x equals 5 is actually stored on the stack, and the value of x is actually 5. Whereas random r equals new random, the r variable is stored on the stack, but the value of that r is actually the address of the data stored on the heap. So we also learned what null was. Null was a value that we can use inside of a reference type variable. So for example, if I did something like this, random r2 equals null, what that means is that the value of R2 is nothing, essentially. It's pointing at nothing. So there's no data stored on the heap that R2 is pointing at. So why is this important right now? So the reason why this is important is because we want to learn what happens when we're dealing with value types and null. So if I try to take the value null and store it inside of int x, let's see what happens. Notice how I'm getting an error. The reason why I'm getting an error is because the value null is only acceptable inside of a reference type variable. And that's because it says to that variable that this variable is not pointing at anything in the heap. But a value type variable is never pointing at anything in the heap. It's stored in the stack and storing an absolute value. However, the reason why we're here today is to learn of how we can put a null value inside of a value type variable. So I want to start off by first learning how we do it, and then after that I'll talk about why we maybe would want to do it. So the answer to this is very simple. All we have to do is convert this into a nullable type. And the way we do that is we add a question mark to the data type of the variable. So next to int, I add a question mark. And notice when I do that, the error goes away. So what's actually going on when I add that question mark? And in reality, behind the scenes, this question mark is really just a shorthand for a specific class. Inside the system namespace, there's a class called Nullable. It is a generic class, which means you can use that class with basically any other class. For example, integers. So I can sort of prove that to you by showing you what properties were now added to this integer variable. So for example, let me delete this. If I do x dot, notice how there's two additional properties. Has value and value. Has value returns a bool, and value returns an integer. So has value is used to figure out if that nullable type has the value null stored in it. If it does, this will return false. Value, on the other hand, will just return the value that is stored in that nullable type if it is not null. So let's go ahead and try to use these built-in properties. So for example, let's say if x dot has value, then actually go ahead and print the value. So I'll say console.writeLine x dot value. Otherwise, I'll say else if x does not have a value or if x is null, then I'm going to say x is null. And if I go ahead and run this, let's see what it prints. And as you can see, it says x is null. Now if I run this again, but I use a valid value, for example, 15, I run it again, now look at what it prints. It prints the number 15, and that is because x.hasValue is now returning true because it is not null. So it returns 15. So that's really it. Nullable types are that easy. Except the more important question is, why would I ever want to use these? So the biggest reason of why you would maybe want to use a nullable type is when you're working with databases. So let's pretend, for example, we have a user table that has a username, a password, a birth date, an age, maybe their first name, their last name, things like that. Now, if you have certain columns that accept null values, or nothing, for example, when you try to query that information in C#, the database is going to return to you a null value. But for example, let's say a user had no age submitted into the database. What happens when you query that row and get that information sent back to you? It will send back to you a null value that you're expecting an integer for. But you can't store that null value into an integer position. So by creating a nullable type, that allows you to now store the null value inside of integers, for example. So as a quick example, let's go ahead and create a very simple program. I'm going to go ahead and delete this code. And if you look at my Solution Explorer, notice how I have a database class. Now I'm going to create this class that's just going to simulate a database call. It's not actually going to talk to a database at all. So I want to make a simple method. A method to get the age for a user. So I'm going to say public, and my return type, I'm going to create a nullable integer. So I'm going to say int question mark. And I'm going to say get user's age. And this method requires a string called user. So if you want to get a user's age, you simply call this method, passing in the user's name, and it will return to you the age. But to simulate that the user had no age in the database, I'm going to return null here. So if you think about it for a second, whatever logic you had here that is talking to the database, if that actually did return a null and then you just return that value back to the caller, this would most likely be an integer. And then you would get an error, because notice what happens. It's saying, I can't return null to an integer. So this is why I want to use a nullable integer, because I'm expecting information to come back from a database that could potentially return me null. So to finish this up, let's go back to main and let's actually create a simple call to this method. So I'll create an instance of my database, and I'm going to go ahead and try to call the method. I'll say d.getUsersAge, and I'll pass in Jesse. But remember, this is returning a nullable integer. So let's go ahead and create a variable of that. So let's say int question mark user age equals. So I'm trying to call this method passing in Jesse. This is going to go off, call a database, and return to me the age of Jesse. Now, because this is a database, it could potentially return to me null, so I made it a nullable integer. So now I can simply protect myself by saying, if the user age dot has a value, then let's go ahead and print out the user age dot actual value. Otherwise, if it was null, if user age has the value null in it, let's go ahead and print no valid age, which means that user never entered in their age to the database. So if I run this program, it's going to say no valid age. Alright guys, so that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please ask me in the comments below. And if you want the source code for this exercise, check out the description.